been doing over the last several years in Tunis, investigating how long this revolutionary moment of 2011 might last. And her presentation today is entitled Revolution, Rewind, Politics as Duration in Tunisia. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you for everyone to join me here and for the invitation. And yeah, I've got a paper. I think it's going to be about 45 minutes, if that's okay. And then I'm ready for your questions. And I'm slightly overwhelmed by the Tunis experts and Tunisia experts here, and hopefully it's going to go okay. So, and you know, Rory and colleagues in this space are the experts on Tunisian politics. So I'm a little apprehensive about this, how this paper will be received, being as it is built on long-term conversations and reflections rather than contemporary political analysis. Indeed, perhaps I should state from the start that my aim today is not to offer a political analysis of Tunisia, especially of the contemporary political complexity of Tunisia. Rather, my interest is to address what the political is or may be in the first place when engaged ethnographically and traced through the words and lives of friends and research interlocutors. In this sense, this is a paper as much about modes of thinking about politics and more specifically political revolutions as about the Tunisian revolution of 2010, 2011 and its aftermath. This is not because I don't find the so-called Jasmine Revolution of importance or interest. Quite the opposite. It is because it is so crucial that I think it is important to trace its possible effects on the ways in which we think about revolutions more broadly and political unrest more expansively. Here I take direct inspiration from the work of Behrouz Gamari Tabrizi on the Iranian Revolution. And in his book, Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution and the Enlightenment in particular, he argues for the importance of attending to what he calls the unscripted political practices of the Iranian Revolution. And his work shows what happens when we attempt, even for a moment, to understand revolutions beyond the Enlightenment discursive frames that make revolution legible along Eurocentric theories of power, politics, and history. And this paper is, in a sense, a humble take on Gamari Tabrizi's invitation to think of revolutions beyond common political scripts. I follow this invitation by addressing how the effects of the Tunisian revolution, as well as the duration of these effects, can be seen as defying common understandings of what political change should look like and where it should register. In particular, I want to address how change stays, even when it blatantly doesn't, in the places and on the structures that are generally where revolutions and political change more generally are read and made legible, from elections to law to personal freedoms. Now, there is no doubt that elections, personal freedoms, and law are of crucial importance, both for analysis and, more importantly for me, to people who are directly affected by them. And I will be addressing in a moment how a lot of the conversations I have these days with Tunisian friends and interlocutors are, for example, about the whirlwind of Tunisian parliamentary democracy since the revolution. But my question is, how do we make also other kinds of changes visible in our analysis? The kinds of changes I will discuss in this paper, such as changes to personal biographies or changes to embodied reactions to the police when you see them on the street. When I say make visible, I don't mean simply recounting them as cute ethnographic details about a wider sociopolitical process we already know. What I mean is, how do we make this count, weigh, or shape our conceptual imagination of what revolutionary change is and can look like? In 2015, I started a project on memories of the Tunisian Revolution of 2010-2011. The project was an opportunity really to speak with Tunisian long-standing family friends and acquaintances living in my northern Italian hometown, a key destination of Tunisian migration since the 1980s. Some people I spoke with had been living in Italy since the 80s. They followed the days of revolution, as they were often referred to, through cable TV, YouTube, and constant, exhilarated, worried, excited, incredulous calls and texts with family back in Tunisia. Some happened to be in Tunisia visiting family over the Italian Christmas break and got caught up in the events of the revolution. I remember a call between my father and his family friend Karim on Christmas Day of 2010. In Italy since 1982, working on construction sites, Karim was visiting his hometown in the southern suburbs of Tunis when protests began escalating across the country, including in the streets of his childhood neighborhood. Karim called my father early in the morning as he was walking home from his shift to stand outside the local hardware shop to guard it from looters, a form of impromptu neighborhood watch that became even more prominent in certain areas of Tunisia once President Ben Ali escaped in January 2011. Karim was tired after the long night on the streets, but also full of electric life. I have never seen anything like this, he said. I have never seen this anywhere, ever. As I began my work on memories of the Tunisian Revolution, the electric, euphoric, amazed texture of Karim's words echoed in the stories I was hearing, despite more than 4 years had passed from the events. As I've mentioned, this project on memories initially involved Tunisian friends and acquaintances in my Italian hometown. It quickly evolved into trips to and stays in Tunisia itself, first accompanying friends and visiting their hometowns, then independently and through other networks. The stories I collected in this period were mainly from young people from Tunis and suburbs who took to the streets during the revolution, which generally refers to the events that took place in the brief temporal parenthesis between the death of Bouazizi in 2010 and the escape of Ben Ali in January 2011 and its immediate aftermath. During this revolutionary period, my interlocutors participated, together with general contestations in the capital, in different acts of violent dissent in the suburbs, including riots against local police forces, resistance to counter-revolutionary currents, and collective neighborhood vigilance. Even if a number of years had passed, this was in 2015 when I first started, and as I will return to in a moment, there was widespread disillusionment with the present. The days of revolution were discussed with pride, emotion, and surprise. People spoke about this period as a revealing moment, not only about politics and collective action, but also about themselves. Yassin, a young man from a working class neighborhood at the outskirts of Tunis, tells me, "It makes you dizzy when you think of how fast things went those days, but dizzy in a good way. Those days of revolution were magical. It was like magic. You speak with the most cynical person you can find. You ask him to tell you about those days when we were all in the street, days and nights in the streets, eating together, fighting against the police together, shouting together. They were beautiful days, and I was proud of their beauty. There was a lot of violence and blood and smoke, but they were still beautiful." The days immediately following the escape of Ben Ali on 14 January 2011 are recounted with particular intensity. These are the days when, in the political void, areas of Tunis were under attack both from looters and, importantly, from counter-revolutionary forces, including snipers, who during this period of confusion reappeared in different parts of the country, murdering a number of civilians and deeply shocking the population. Mustafa, a man in his early 20s, tells me, "Those days were the best days of my life. I have never experienced anything like those days, and I never will again. We were in the streets of the neighborhood, day and night, protecting the houses. We made checkpoints to be sure nobody came in when we didn't trust, or that nobody left with stolen stuff. There was no police to protect us. We were fighting the police on the one hand and protecting our homes on the other side. I have never seen anything like it. The women brought us food on the streets, the best food of my life, eaten on the streets with my friends and my neighbors. We were very serious about our duty. We were standing in front of houses and shops with our sticks. We were ready to do anything, to die if necessary. We didn't mind dying. We were ready for it. There were snipers those days, put by Ben Ali's people. They were on roofs and sometimes they shot people in the head while they were buying bread or walking down the street. But this didn't push us back into our homes. It's strange, and it sounds a bit embarrassing now, he says, but during those days, suddenly life meant so much, we were ready to die for it. Now, these powerful, conceptually refined testimonies contrast starkly with how most of my Tunisian research interlocutors, acquaintances, friends, and family friends speak today about their country. Already in 2015, there was a widespread, though I should say not unanimous and never simplistic, sense that the revolution was being failed. And today, more than 10 years after the revolution, and in the midst of what is being ominously called the 21-22 Tunisian political crisis, comments are even bleaker. Indeed, while in 2015, the general sense I got from my interlocutors was a disappointment with the lack of change, for example, in terms of corruption or life costs and possibilities. In my latest conversation with Tunisian acquaintances, comments, at least the opening comments, are often that things have changed with the revolution, but for the worst. For anyone who has followed the dominant analysis and commentary on the Tunisian revolution and the so-called Arab Spring more generally, these bleak comments come as no surprise. From its very inception, the Tunisian revolution has been analyzed from influential outlets such as The Economist to academic circles in terms of what it lacks. It lacked clear leadership, it lacked organized revolutionary movements, it lacked ideological, political, or intellectual aims. This is what the kind of dominant discourse said from the very beginning. As Gamari Tabrizi argues, the very language of an Arab Spring, which he traces back to dominant Western commentators, is a discourse, and I quote him, constructed to close the window of possibilities and subject the uprising to historical inevitabilities. Whether it was a reference to Prague of 1968 or Europe of 1848, Gamari Tabrizi argues that the language of the Arab Spring framed the events of 2010 onwards as a triumph of liberalism and the discovery of enlightenment in the Arab world. More than this, it straitjacketed the unscripted events happening in places like Tunisia to rigid, recognized patterns of revolutionary transformation. In short, for Gamari Tabrizi, revolutions such as the Tunisian one were not recognized the right to be read in their particularity, beyond Enlightenment understandings of history as progress, and in terms of the possible realities, rather than the real possibilities, opened in the revolutionary moment itself. Why does this matter for my own material about memories of the revolution I am presenting here? For two main reasons. First, because the stories about the days of the Tunisian revolution I have collected so far, while increasingly difficult to elicit, provide a glimpse into the importance of, to steal again from Gamari Tabrizi, saving what he calls, and I quote him, the integrity of the revolutionary moment from its later outcomes. The power of the revolutionary moment itself, expressed so strikingly by the stories, memories, and experiences of those who were on the streets in late 2010 and early 2011 in Tunisia, needs to bear much stronger conceptual weight in our understanding of the Tunisian revolution and of political change more generally. What happens, I ask, if we were to allow theoretical affordance to the moment itself rather than only to what came after it? As years pass, it becomes increasingly difficult to access what Gamari Tabrizi calls the integrity of the revolutionary moment, rather than to focus on what came afterwards. This is not necessarily because the revolutionary moment has been forgotten. If anything, the opposite is true, as I'll return to it in a moment. Rather, it is because more pressing themes often emerge in conversations. The later outcomes Gamari Tabrizi warns us against when theorizing revolution often simply steal the attention, particularly in the past 6 months since President Sayed's dismissal of government and parliament. Amongst contemporary political and personal upheavals, Today, it sometimes feels like a demanding, maybe even painful indulgence to think back at the revolutionary moment of December 2010. But even in a context of powerful later outcomes that Gamari Tabrizi asks us to put in pause when taking seriously the revolutionary moment, when the days of revolution do come up, when the conversation suddenly allows to sit with the revolutionary moment of 2010, 2011, its untamable possibility reemerges, even if temporarily. That Iranian professor is right, Mustafa tells me over the phone just a couple of weeks ago when I call him to catch up and tell him about this paper. If you think of the past through the present, you don't really get it. You don't understand what happened. You start listing that this didn't work and that hasn't changed and this politician is still a joke and that policeman is still corrupt. You kind of miss it all. You miss what actually happened those days, I suppose, what actually opened. There is a second reason why interrogating dominant schemata through which political events, such as the Tunisian Revolution, are immediately made legible matters for this material. As I've said, I do take Gamari Tabrizi's point that there is a need to pay much closer, sustained, and indeed decolonial attention to the revolutionary moment itself and the possibilities it radically opens, posing any predetermined realpolitik analysis of its aftermath. However, the truth is that one of the things that has always struck me the most about stories of the Tunisian Revolution is the description of its outcomes in dimensions or spheres beyond those addressed in mainstream conventional analysis, both of the Arab Spring and of political change more broadly. My sense is that Gamari Tabrizi's invitation to disentangle the specificity of a revolutionary moment from a dominant analysis that attributes, and I quote him, theoretical significance to European historical experience is necessary also when thinking of revolutionary effects, aftermath, and afterlives. I had the first sense of the problematic, scripted way the Tunisian Revolution's outcomes or effects were being read when the movement of Tunisians across the Mediterranean in early 2011 was immediately classified as desperate escape, both from Tunisia and from the revolution. As I have written elsewhere in my work on Mediterranean migrations, when young Tunisians started arriving in southern Italy during and straight after the revolution, the Italian and international press swiftly adopted a language of crisis. These young men arriving on the Italian island of Lampedusa, we were told, were desperate, were vulnerable people escaping from the revolution. And incidentally, they were going to inundate Europe. Not only this reading of this movement across the Mediterranean exemplified perfectly the kind of desire for the West rationale Gamari Tabrizi identifies as framing the mediatic and scholarly discourse of and about the Arab Spring more broadly. In doing so, it also completely missed the point, to quote my friend Mustafa, on what had just happened and what was still happening. People travel for a multitude of reasons, and it is not my intention or aim here to provide a simplified or simplistic reading of Mediterranean crossings. However, many of the Tunisians with whom I have spoken who crossed the Mediterranean at the height of the revolution tell a very different story about the relationship between migration and revolution. Interlocutors such as Mustafa, who traveled to Europe during or shortly after the national upheaval, never mention escaping from a revolution that many of them contributed in participating. They never described their dangerous crossing to Europe as a desperate act. If anything, they speak of a crossing that was made possible by their experience of the revolution, by the courage and defiance that they learned from it. Indeed, migration writer and journalist Gabriele Del Grande has put forward the argument that those young Tunisians were instantiating a second rebellion, this time not against the regime, but against a border that they considered unjust and against a legal ban on travel to Europe that they experienced as claustrophobic. I bring up the case of, if you will, revolutionary migrations to provide an example of the premises and consequences of applying scripted analytical modes to specific revolutionary moments. But what I want to discuss in the remainder of this paper is another dimension of the Tunisian revolution, which I feel also pushes us to interrogate dominant assumptions, not only about what a revolution should look like, but also where and how its effects should be read and understood. My Tunisian acquaintances often make two seemingly contradictory assertions: that nothing has changed with the revolution, and that nothing will be the same in their own lives after it. Let me, just close my email because it's stressing me out. Yes. The people I know speak with disappointment about the outcomes of the revolution. Some point out that there are still no jobs, that the economic situation is worse than before the revolution, and that ultimately, for young people, migration to Europe remains the only real option for a decent life. Others argue that the old Ben Ali Guard still holds real power, real money, and real access to jobs. And others still comment on how the revolution may have brought some freedoms of press, of opinion, of religion, but has not changed people's economic situation. And some bleak, disillusioned, and cynical comments often prevail when people address what came after the revolution. This has become even more the case over the past 2 years, with the pandemic hitting Tunisia incredibly hard and with the cost of living soaring. Ryan, in his late teens when the revolution happened and now living in Italy, tells me that in his latest visit home in the southern suburbs of Tunis, prices, and I quote him, were immoral. He tells me he spent all his Italian savings just doing normal day-to-day things. And to drive his point home, he tells me also of his old school friend who works in one of the Tunis Coca-Cola factories and whose salary, for what is considered a relatively good, regular, respectable job, only covers half the month, and definitely does not allow him to even begin to think of things like marriage and family. Ryan also tells me that while a few years ago, even in the midst of hardship, an offhand comment like "it was better before," meaning before the revolution, would be contrasted by someone in the room. Today, that would be the silent and even spoken consensus, in many rooms, to be honest, Ryan says. However, even in the midst of these stories of economic and prospective dispossession, and even in the context where the post-revolutionary period is framed not only as disappointing, but also as worse than what existed before, Tunisian friends and interlocutors are explicit that when it comes to their own lives, the revolution has left an indelible mark in and on them. These marks are not only bodily marks, physical signs of police beatings, wounds from escaping tear gas, injuries from being crushed in a crowd. I am referring here also to other kinds of marks, marks that could be qualified perhaps as a kind of internal switch, a switch that happened during the days of revolution and has outlived the revolutionary period itself. Let me give a couple of examples of these switches. Now, first and most importantly, I am thinking of the ways in which young men in particular speak of what I call the evaporation of fear, something that happened during the days of revolution, but lasted beyond it. Reference to this evaporation of fear emerges most powerfully when men speak about their relationship with the police. Before the revolution, as teenagers growing up in working class suburbs of Tunis, one was constantly scared of, and definitely constantly alert towards, the humiliating violence of the police. They could take you away on any excuse, take you away and lock you up, put you in a cell, tie you up in what we call the dijaj, the chicken position, hands and feet tied to a long stick, and you would be left hanging there for as long as they wanted. Sami tells me of his memories of the police before the revolution. They would stop you on your bike and ask for money, just like that. They would come really close to your face and speak about your sister, your mother, your grandmother, and they would continue pushing and pushing and pushing with words until you could not stand it anymore and you would react. And then they would beat you. Or sometimes they would just laugh, which was worse. Stories about the revolution very much intersect with stories about the relationship between young men and the police and the evaporation of fear produced by the revolution. Sami tells me, I don't know how, but since the revolution, when the police stop me in the street, my heart doesn't start beating like crazy. My hands don't start sweating. My head stays up. It's like my body has changed. It's not like I trust the police more or like I think it's less probable they'll hurt me or insult me. So that has changed too, he concedes. But I'm simply not frightened. Frankly, I'm not really frightened of anything anymore. And once you're not frightened, many interlocutors have explained to me, everything changes with the police. A different kind of relationship emerges and stays. This freedom from fear often arises from conversations about the police, but then expands to discussions of other state representatives, of exams, of starting a new job, of crossing the Mediterranean. Interestingly, together with a radical shift in their relationship with the police, some of my interlocutors have described a radical shift in their relationship also with others around them. For example, Amin, now in his early 30s, and a former committed and, according both to himself and his friends, pretty violent football ultra for one of the two main teams in Tunis, Espérance, tells me, you can't imagine this now, but before the revolution, my life was Espérance. I used to go to all the games. I never missed one. I used to go to the gym so I could hit harder. I used to always be in fights with the police and with other ultras. I always got into fights with ultras, inside and outside the stadium. It was my life. At home, if a supporter of club, the other big Tunis football team, would come into the room, I would just leave, just get up and leave. But when the revolution started, when they were shooting in the streets and there was war in my neighborhood, when I went in the street and helped the people bleeding and started throwing stones at the police to defend the younger ones, for me, we were all the same suddenly. I don't know, we suddenly were all Tunisians, full stop. My neighbor, a club fan, we had many fights in the past. I punched him in the face once, I remember, outside the stadium. Well, this neighbor, he gave me lemon at some point for my eyes. They were stinging for the tear gas. I gave him my hand to thank him. We shook hands. We had never shaken hands before, imagine. Lived next door for 25 years and never shook hands. We needed a revolution for that. Amin continues after a pause. And then after the revolution, the feeling I had during the revolution just stayed. I was just unable to feel the same anger, the same hate against other teams. It just wasn't here anymore. He touches his heart, and it's never really come back. It's gone. Now I look at other people in the stadium, and all I see is people, insan. Amin says this last sentence with a kind of melancholic sadness. The revolution has stayed so powerfully that it has taken away something he actually enjoyed, even if, looking back, he sees it as violent and thuggish. And without that infusion of ultra energy in his whole life has changed and has remained changed since the revolution. What is really interesting about the kinds of changes Amin and Sami speak about is that there is a sense in which the switches happened and stayed despite themselves, and sometimes even against the subject's wishes. The kind of formative relationship between revolution and subjects commented upon by much anthropological literature on revolution seems to be crystallized in these passing reflected moments, where people like Amin and Sami comment on how certain dimensions of the self are left altered by the revolutionary moment, from one's physical reaction to police presence to one's joyful rage in a stadium. So this section is called So What? So how long does a revolution last? and where should its presence and consequences be registered ethnographically, conceptually, politically. As I said in the opening of this talk, this paper is a humble initial take on Gamari Tabrizi's fundamental invitation to think of revolutions beyond common political scripts. I have tried to follow this invitation by addressing how the effects of the Tunisian revolution, as well as the duration of these effects, can be seen defying common understandings of what political change should look like and where it should register. What happens to our thinking about revolution when change stays, but not necessarily in the places and on the structures that are generally where revolutions and political change more generally are read and made legible? Expressing his irritation for self-proclaimed destroyers of the old, creators of the new of his time, Antonio Gramsci wrote in the prison notebooks that destruction is as difficult as creation. Now, Gramsci, as some of you may know, was pointing to the fact that superficial change, for example, the destruction of material things, may well remain superficial and therefore historically pathetic rather than grand, if not accompanied by other kinds of deeper destructions. The longer quote of this classic aphorism reads, "Destruction is difficult. Indeed, it is as difficult as creation. For it is not a question of destroying material things. What is at stake is the destruction of relations that are invisible, impalpable, even though they are hidden in material things." Now, as a way of conclusion, I want to flip upside down or inside out Gramsci's point on destruction and creation. While Gramsci irritably focuses on, if you will, the impermanence of superficial change, I want to focus instead on the permanence of deeper change, change that may be invisible at the socioeconomic, but also formally political level. My argument is that apparent absence of superficial destruction at certain orders of magnitude, so for example, the order of political or economic change, as is the case for some, at least in Tunisia, may not imply the absence of change at more deeper, intangible depth, for example, within the person herself. My sense is that attending to these internal, at times invisible and impalpable depth may reveal something of the very nature and proportion of revolution. In the stories and memories I have been collecting since 2015 about the Tunisian revolution, my sense is that something crucial is contained in the peculiar outliving within the subject of a revolutionary moment that has finished, indeed for some has actually failed outside of them. This outliving opens a number of important questions, and a crucial one for me regards the political relevance of such permanence, or in more anthropological terms, the relationship between, on the one hand, this extended duration at individual level of the revolutionary moment, and on the other hand, external orders of magnitude and power. Given the fragile political and economic situation of post-revolutionary Tunisia, it would be easy to listen to my interlocutors' stories about these internal switches and classify them as simple individual experiences with no actual political or revolutionary consequence. But let me suggest two possible objections to this analysis, and in doing so, explain why I think how and where a revolutionary moment may stay requires our close attention. Now, first, it is crucial to remember that these seemingly private individual switches happened in a radically collective moment. Indeed, it was the radical collective action that characterized the days of revolution that provoked these individual switches or changes in the first place. The fact that today these radical ruptures seem to survive inside individuals, but not necessarily outside of them, for example, in structures of power or in the economic organization of the country, in a sense points to the resilience of a collective moment within the subject, and also to the ability of the subject to retain collective revolutionary action beyond the event itself. But it is not entirely accurate to focus solely on the interiority of people. Indeed, this would be my second objection to an analysis of revolutionary permanence as simple private experience with limited political implications. My objection concerns the fact that these switches that took place during the days of revolution unavoidably affected, if you will, interiority and exteriority at once. The days of revolution produced a shift not only within people, but also in their relationships with others, from the state to the police, from neighbors to parents. Indeed, it is precisely in the relationship with others, for example, the evaporation of fear towards the police, for some of my friends or interlocutors, that the permanence of the revolutionary moment within the subject continues to manifest and renew itself. Here is where political relevance comes to mind, to me at least. What happens, for example, to the very structural organization of political power in Tunisia when one of its main pre-revolutionary foundations, young working class men's fear of the police, has, for some at least, evaporated from the inside out? The reverberations of these relational ruptures are not necessarily easy to trace, neither in time nor in space, nor across differently positioned individuals or groups. For example, and I want to state this clearly here, while for some the relationship with the police has shifted with and since the revolution, for others it definitely hasn't, and never has. Positionality, privilege, age, and as well as racializing, gendered, and class mechanisms affect the relationship between the police and the people in Tunisia as anywhere else. My argument here is not for a moment that everything is now fine with the police, that suddenly nobody is scared, or that nobody in Tunisia is subjected to the kinds of violent logics that characterize policing the world over. What I am suggesting, however, is to take seriously, and with seriously, I mean give appropriate conceptual weight in our thinking to those testimonies, to those experiences that testify to a different kind of permanence, to a different kind of effect and duration of the revolutionary moment, especially in a context where the revolution is increasingly seen as somehow failing. As Gramsci wrote in the prison notebooks, and I quote him again, "It is not a question of destroying material things. What is at the stake here is the destruction of relations that are invisible and impalpable." The relational changes my Tunisian interlocutors are describing may be pointing to grander ruptures than expected on all sides, precisely because the revolutionary moment has happened at deep, impalpable scales. That's it. Sorry, it's even shorter than I thought.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. It's such a pleasure to, having spent all my time working in terms of political science, to hear about this considered through the eyes of an anthropologist. It's really interesting, and it makes me think, reflect in interesting ways on what's been going on. And it definitely ties into literatures that we have in political science and in political sociology, right? It makes me think about Donatella Della Porta's ideas of eventful protest. Mm-hmm. So in other words, not just looking at the causes of protest or how protest connects to government repression or democratic transition, but also the kinds of cognitive or effective or relational impacts that it can have. Dina Bishara has just written an article about this, talking about the generative power of protest, which is all about looking at these effects that we might otherwise sort of overlook. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. I have questions, but are there others who would like to ask? Yeah, so let's just fire away with some questions, shall we? And then I'll come back with my question. Nate, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. First, Rory, thank you so much for letting me know about this event. That was a really exciting paper. I also come from a political science background, so I think it's partially, maybe it's my frustrations with my own discipline that makes your research even more exciting to me. So I had a few thoughts. You posed this question of how long these revolutionary moments last, and I wasn't quite clear on where you where your answer lies. I mean, it seems like you're arguing perhaps that revolutionary moments last forever, or that they last as long as those who participated in them live, or their memories live. So I guess I would have appreciated maybe a clearer answer to that question. Your work reminds me of Lauren Berlant's work on cruel optimism. And I bring that up in part, and she defines that as a relation in which something you come to desire becomes an obstacle to your flourishing. And that work is used by Lisa Wedeen in her recent book on how the Assad regime was able to kind of create this cruel optimism that ended up blocking change during the protests. So it occurs to me that might be work that you might want to engage with. I also, it occurred to me that you seem to kind of sidestep some of the debates within Tunisia on when the revolution actually started. Was it December 17th or January 14th? And whether or not the revolution continues. And so I would like to hear kind of whether those questions have come up and what your interlocutors say about them. It occurred to me also that I was a little bit disappointed with the section on the political consequences of what you're describing, because it seems like the political consequences are really great, but you focus mainly on this evaporation of fear of the police among at least one social group, although you mentioned that, you know, maybe you might be overstating it and there are many other social groups who remain quite fearful of the police. I wonder if the political consequence is that this disappointment that is often expressed, which seems to have many clear political manifestations, whether it's actually driven by the kind of empowerments created by this revolutionary moment that you describe. So I guess I'm curious, you know, to what extent is disappointment related to this empowerment? And then I also just wanted to mention, I was really interested, and I agree with how you describe, you know, how migration is described as this desperate escape from the revolution. Protests are also often described as, you know, expressions of disappointment or rage rather than expressions of, you know, empowerment that might have come from the revolution. I also wanted to say I really appreciated the statement, nothing has changed and nothing is the same. I think you should definitely leave that in the paper. That's very apt. So thank you so much, and I hope I look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Rory, should I reply? How do political scientists organize?
There are no rules here. You do what you want.
Oh, so you're like anthropologists. No rules. So should I reply now, or?
I mean, the usual
sure,
thing.
Why don't you reply?
Sorry, Tom, did you speak?
Yeah, I was just saying, normally just deal with one at a time.
Okay.
Otherwise it can get lost, can't it?
Okay. Yeah, and these already, thank you, Nate. These already are so many questions, so I apologize in advance that I'm not going to be able to address them properly, all of them. Well, it's first of all a real pleasure to, you know, to be amongst scholars from different disciplines. And I was quite nervous about this because I haven't really given this paper anywhere at all. So I haven't been in the security of my anthropology comrades before coming to you. So I'm hyper exposing myself. And I should say that my long-term work is in Morocco. And this work has really come out of, and that's why, you know, I stated this at the beginning, of stories of, you know, like people I grew up with, or friends mainly of my parents and then their children, of just telling these incredible stories of the revolution while it was happening, and feeling that there was a lot to explore with them about these themes. So any comment is incredibly welcome and really interesting. And I suppose I'll start from your slide. Irritation is unfair, but kind of disappointment. You were very kind, but basically saying you ask a question, but you don't answer it. And I think anthropologists are often really irritating to the disciplines for that reason. I think often what we do is bring questions and then kind of unpack other people's questions by saying, oh, but by asking this question, you already decided what the political is, for example. So I'm kind of doing that a little bit, but I think you're also catching on the fact that I'm still asking. I basically don't have an answer, and I think I am still exploring what possible answers may be, while at the same time trying not to foreclose possibilities, which is what the work of Tamari Tabrizi, which has really influenced me in a completely different context of the Iranian Revolution, but also he has commented explicitly on the, I suppose, Western rendering of the Arab Spring. It invites us to do so. Don't foreclose possibilities by what he says, taking European experience as theoretical, guidance, and that's his problem with the term, of course, Arab Spring and so on. So yeah, the first thing is that the questions are open because they are genuinely still open, and I think I need to find a way to keep them open and also give a bit more. That's, I feel, one of the big challenges ahead by developing this paper. Again, so many other things I need to think them through in my own time. But one thing I'd say about disappointment, the voicing of disappointment and disillusionment and its relationship with a sense of empowerment, or even a sense that one's voice and political analysis matters, and its relationship with one's experience with the revolution. I think this is something that I've discussed a lot with Tunisian friends in Italy, for example, of how the way, the deep disappointment towards specific outcomes is also connected to the kind of how high the revolution positioned the stakes. And if the revolution would have never happened, you wouldn't be even judging that politician along these lines. Do you see what I'm saying? So in a way, the bar was lifted so high that then the comparisons and disappointment, there's bigger space for comparison, disappointment, and disillusionment. So I really think that's a really important point, which I need to think through more. And the debates in Tunisia about duration, I think that's basically something that is missing in my knowledge, to be very honest, beyond the kind of maybe superficial reading of, debate, superficial reading, not superficial literature at all, about, for example, the long debates on trade unionism and the ways in which actually, if any, you were suggesting what about the date later, say, what I found really interesting and helpful, and you're completely right, I don't mention it here at all, is all the literature that says actually the revolution was there if you follow closely, for example, trade union movements and the organizing movements in that sense. So if I want to stay with duration, then I think I need to actually explore further the debates that are happening around this. That's really good advice / critique. What else? Yeah, I mean, the debate about, that's kind of my area of expertise, if you will, Mediterranean migrations, and what I've written about. And there's always this really complex, and I'm teaching a course right now, a postgraduate course on migrations, and this thin line between acknowledging forms of oppression and pain and death that come with migration, especially Mediterranean migration, and the racializing languages that basically talk about stuff like joy and excitement and curiosity only when basically white European tourists are spoken of, and not when other forms of travel are analyzed. So suddenly, themes of joy or excitement suddenly disappear from our language, and we're talking about dispossession, poverty, and how do you talk about that while also not forgetting dispossession and poverty and colonial relations and migration. So that's something I'm really interested in. And again, I suppose more a question than having perfect answers. But yeah, thank you so much. And I have notes for the other points you brought up.
Great. Let's hear Yusuf's question, and then I'm going to go to Sarah after that.
Thank you. Thank you for informing me about the event. And Dr. Elliot, great. I mean, I learned a lot of things, and you're actually capturing what most Tunisians are saying in the street. So you're bringing it up to the light. I had two questions, actually. The first one is related to what you mentioned about the Western conceptualization or rendering of the Arab Spring, which is something that I hear a lot. And I did live in Tunisia, especially in 2011. I remember by then there were stories about transitional justice, about the Constitutional Assembly, and things that were mainly, especially in the first weeks of 2011, brought by either Western NGOs or Western politicians or Western academics, and a lot of things that happened later that you mentioned on the academic level. But my question here is, what was the alternative? I mean, because you say it didn't allow the Tunisian revolution to be explained by Tunisians, if I understood correctly, or explained by those who lived it. What was the alternative? And why then didn't those who made that revolution came up with their own explanation about what happened? And my second question, and I'm not very familiar with how anthropologists work, but all these discussions with Tunisians who are telling all these stories about the snipers, etc., etc. For you, and here I'm interested to learn how an anthropologist looks at this. For you as an anthropologist, how much of that do you believe? Or as an anthropologist, are you in a place to say that this is right and this is wrong? Or you just have to say what they say? I mean, do you take it from a critical point of view or not? Thank you.
Wow, yeah, really good questions. And, you know, okay, shall I start? Which one? I mean, they're both really, I have so much to say and also so much to ask back to you for, because I sense lots of your questions is because you also have your own perspective on, you know, more, for example, the second question, when you're collecting stories, what kind of, I suppose, critical thinking do you apply to them when you then, you know, write a paper about it or present it? And that's, you know, a huge debate in anthropology. So first of all, there's no like straightforward answer. And if you have an anthropology colleague tomorrow here, they would probably give you a very different answer. My understanding and what I find of interest is actually finding ways of giving conceptual weight to people's understandings and storytelling and own theoretical frameworks. So in the sense of a story, for example, of snipers and being in the streets, I see what is interesting and of importance is to follow how that understanding of events has affected the person I am speaking with, their own understanding of those days, their own understanding of the future, their own understanding of the revolution and its outcomes and so on. So that is of more interest, I suppose, to me, and where I feel anthropology has the kind of tools to give theoretical weight to those kind of stories, rather than necessarily fact-checking, if you will. Although one thing does not exclude the other. And I think in a lot of, you know, when you're working in contexts of conflict, or, you know, I have colleagues working on civil war of different kinds, then of course facts are also politics. And so it's not that easy to extricate, I suppose, your responsibility as a teller of stories, say, and as a critical, you know, thinker in that sense. In this case specifically, for me, what was interesting and what is of importance is how this recollection of the past shapes how you understand yourself in the present and how you understand your relationship with the days of revolution. So I think that's what interests me, but I would really be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. And the alternative, I mean, I felt, and again, I'm interested to hear what yourself and other colleagues think about that. But my sense is that the space for possible conceptual alternatives from kind of the Enlightenment understanding of politics was closed very quickly when the so-called Arab Spring, and especially from the Tunisian Revolution, happened. And so there was no real possibility to see alternatives. And I think the big problem we have, and this author, Tamari Tabrizi, also talks about it, and he's a historian, how the kind of words such as freedom and dignity are straight away kind of hoovered up by a kind of Enlightenment understanding of, say, the French Revolution, and very little space in analysis and thinking is then allowed to imagine that they may be meaning different things, or they may be meaning the same things, but through very different routes and for very different reasons. And I think my answer to that question, my initial answer, is then to start tracing other ways in which change may be recorded. And that's why I'm talking about this change for some of the people I've spoken with in their relationship with the police. And I'm asking, could that be a site just as important analytically? So not just as a nice story that an anthropologist you've invited comes by, tells, and then you can say ciao and go back to your theory making. Could actually the fact that for some people that type of fearful relationship with the police has left, could that be seen, for example, as just as an effective revolutionary change as, say, a change in how, well, and that elections happen in the first place, for example. So I'm trying to put these scales to speak to each other without necessarily arguing that they are the same thing, that they mean the same things to people, that they save lives in the same way. So, and I think that's where, going back to your first question or second question, that's where anthropology, I think, if done well, can work also in collaboration with other disciplines, is to remind that the particular, the intimate, the small, if you say, is not less telling necessarily of the grand and the political and the global. So, and this paper is kind of an initial attempt to think along those lines. Does that kind of at least engage with what you're saying? Because this could last forever. But does that kind of at least engage with what you were thinking about?
Yes, thank you. And it was actually a genuine question.
Okay.
I'm hearing good defenses of anthropology here. Good for you. Sarah has a question.
Thank you, Alice. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think it's a really beautiful research pointing out the kind of what you called internal switch, or the personal memories, which are less visible by the mainstream point of view of the revolution, but they still are really important. And also they have political implications, as you have pointed out. And I couldn't stop thinking about my own field work and interviews I had in Tunisia. But although my focus was mainly on social economic protest, but lots of protesters expressed something quite similar to what you mentioned here. And I really like the idea of, okay, people are disappointed and therefore they take to the street. So in a way, social movements are a sign of the failure of the revolution. But in a way, actually, the kind of social movements now we are witnessing in Tunisia are actually possible and empowered by the memory of the revolution. And I think this can be found by in some of the interviews I had, for instance, people say, we, although nothing has changed in terms of socioeconomic structures, but we have the experience of change in the political system. And we know by then we have to keep fighting. So that kind of revolutionary memory gives them to continue their struggle. So I really enjoy that part. But my question is about so one of the things I struggled when I did my interviews was that you mentioned like the mainstream or dominant or Western idea of the revolution and like possibilities for other ways of thinking about the revolution, other notion of the revolution. But what I've discovered is that in many cases, in my interlocutors' memories and their way of thinking about revolution, things are quite mixed together. And I don't know how to put it, whether we can put it as a contradictions or tension. So for instance, a young man who considers revolution as a process, but at the same time consider like a former transitional justice mechanism or constitutions, which are highlighted by the mainstream and Western idea of revolution, also exist. So one person has multiple ideas of the revolution, which is not necessarily a Western dominant idea of revolution, but things are quite mixture. So I'm just wondering if you have also encountered the kind of contradictions or tensions, whatever you call it, in your interviews with the interlocutors, and if so, how do you see that kind of complexity?
Thank you. That's so helpful and really interesting also about your research. I mean, the simple answer is that I think our duty, if you will, as researchers, is to hold that complexity instead of trying to explain it away. Yeah, instead of saying like, okay, I'm gonna just, this person has given me a really complex and refined and and sometimes self-contradictory story, and I'm just gonna simplify. I'm gonna take, I don't know, the Marxist understanding of what revolution is. I'm gonna kind of straitjacket it in that. I think giving space to that complexity is the hard job that I think faces any researcher on any topic. And then some disciplines are more or less acceptant of holding that complexity in your argument, say, than others. But I think that's, if you say what, just listening to you, if I had to ask, what is your argument, say, on the revolution, complexity is one of the answers to that argument, to what you're finding, that, there's no one linear story, and also different models of understanding. And just to clarify, what I'm suggesting is, following Tamari Tabrizi's highlighting of how powerful kind of Western understandings of what the revolution should be like and what it should deliver, doesn't mean that, people themselves are not also, reading Marx or Gramsci or, like, that's not the point, that there's like these insular ways. Either you understand revolution this way, or you understand it in this kind of, say, Islamic inspired way. I think those all exist on the ground, but I think then how do we analytically give space to different, I suppose, imaginations of what the revolution can and should be is the task. So in that sense of complexity and I think it's always there. And one thing, that hasn't come up yet, but I had the last section of the paper, which is left blank, that is called, because I have all this question about how long does a revolution last? And then I have a section saying, how long does an argument last? So basically what happens now is that often, especially family friends, so the people I know best, when I call them up or I see them and I ask about the revolution, the first thing they do is roll their eyes. And they're like, can we please talk about, stuff that's happening now? And so there's also that interesting relationship between, I suppose, what the researcher is interested and committed to, and what, the people you're working with are thinking and living through. And that, all research is a conversation, but how that works out. So yeah, that's just an extra complexity to the field of doing research on these topics. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anush, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alice, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I'm another of these political scientists who is siloed, I'm afraid. So I can swim through the currents that you discussed, but I have difficulties keeping my head above water all the time. And so revolution, you know, and Sharon has already alluded to this. If you begin to see it as a process, then it's much harder to put the present in a context, because it's an ongoing role of its unfolding social, economic, political, cultural, imaginative things happening at the same time. But also, if we call it revolution, then inevitably it's about communities, about social groups, dare I say about classes, and how they relate to the process of change, whether in that instant or whether as a longer term transition also is different. The imaginations of different classes of people. I have somebody who actually sat through the Egyptian uprisings for me and wrote diaries of different interpretations of what was going on throughout. And it's very clear that different strata, let's call them classes, have different perceptions of what is going on. So the self itself is subjective, and it's part of a social fabric which is being torn apart. So to then isolate an individual and look at them in that moment is by definition a snapshot. It doesn't really go beyond capturing the magnitude of change that might have happened, is happening, and could still happen. But also where there is ideological baggage, there is a easier, if you like, way of explaining things. When there is an ideological baggage, it becomes much more tangential. And Tunisia is a case in point, Egypt too, that the absence of ideology in driving revolution ultimately is about violence. It's about disorder. It's about power and re-empowerment and so on. That itself is really important, that in the absence of ideology, interpretation is then individualized. Whereas if there is an ideology that drives that transition, that force, that change, it leaves an imprint on the psyche of the individual, but also of the collective. So could part of the explanation be in that there was an ideology, there wasn't that transition from one to another, and that absence of a core means that this becomes a moving target in so many ways. And if it is, then capturing it in one moment becomes really important, because that is of historical value, but it doesn't really explain the before and the after.
Thank you, Nush. Lots of different points. Just a couple of things, I suppose. First of all, yeah, I mentioned, you know, that the Tunisian revolution from the very start was analyzed, you know, in terms of what it was lacking, and definitely the lack of a clear leader or leadership and the lack of a specific ideology was brought to the fore by different types of analysis as well, I feel as weighing down on a moment that straight away needed to, I suppose, be measured by what has already happened. And I suppose that's a part of the argument I'm putting forward, is that expecting of something new to have to be molded into something that has already happened has its effects in then how we even allow ourselves as theorists or students or researchers or people involved to even allow ourselves to imagine if there is a possibility of something different. And I think nobody would, debate against the point you're making that there wasn't like at least one specific ideology in that sense. And a lot of contemporary social movements, I would say, are tasked or criticized that in those terms. But I think even in a context where we were able to if it were possible to identify an ideology, I think it would be problematic to assume that therefore everybody is affected in the same way, experiences and understands the ideology in the same way. So I think that type of diversity that may be slightly, I mean, you're very kind, you say it's important, but I think it's also slightly annoying, like the kind of openness to extreme diversity, I think wouldn't necessarily disappear even if there were a very strong ideology, because then, if you do a close ethnographic study, say, you then realize that the ideology is experienced also across gender, the class lines in very different ways. And the other thing about, taking stories of individuals and what can they tell us, I agree. I mean, that relationship I find it really fascinating between an individual story and a political process, or an individual story and, history or change. I suppose the luck I've had is that with the people I keep calling them young people because they were, late teenagers when the revolution happened, but 10 years have passed now. I've had a continuing relationship with these people, and they're part of my life or of my research. But of course, it's a very limited number of people of a very similar background, but very limited numbers. And there again, I find this conversation really interesting, because I suppose in anthropology, numbers matter less, and kind of the kind of qualitative dimension is allowed to weigh more, but then it has limits when we try to speak to other disciplines, because, it's like, okay, how many people have you spoken with? Oh, 4, but for 15 years. And then, political scientists are like, oh, brava, cha, and there's this, and I think, I suppose the issue is here, what different types of knowledge can you develop and understand by speaking in depth, say for 10 years with 5 people, versus doing a survey in a specific moment, as you say, with 100. I don't think it's just different types of knowledges we're talking about. And then one last point that you really helpfully reminded me of, and I think that's also so important, and I haven't spoken about it enough. It also goes back to Nate's point about duration, and looking about how duration of the revolution is actually discussed in Tunisia itself. I'm just thinking, in Cuba, for example, they talk about the triumph of the revolution when the revolution happened, but the actual term revolution is in the present. So the idea is not that there was the revolution and now it's post-revolutionary. The revolution is, and of course there's an ideology and a specific understanding of politics and the subject and state in that context. So I think I need to go back to also think, I'm kind of assuming that the revolution is an event of the past and it's finished, and now we have to argue about whether it left good or bad effects, say. But maybe this process needs to be taken more serious, kind of the Cuban line, if you will, that the revolution is an ongoing process. And then there's the triumph when it actually happens, needs to be taken more seriously and unpacked more. So I think, that idea of process needs to be attended more closely too.
May I, Rory, just interject very quickly? I do apologize. Other people, I'm sure, have got a lot more important things to say. But just 2 very quick points, Alice. That is that actually revolution creates new pathways. So it's not a process in the way that is, as you rightly said, linear. It is about creating traction in a different way. And that is why it's so important to see it as an ongoing unfolding of norms to a new set of norms. But the issue about identity, let's not call it ideology, takes me to the root of your own kind of interest in this, Iranian Revolution. Of course, Iranian Revolution was heavily ideologized, and that shaped the narrative, the consciousness, to use Gramscian terms, of the revolution. That's what I was getting at, that actually in Tunisia, that wasn't there. While there were movements, while there were ideas, while there were even organizations and individuals who were revolutionary, there wasn't a stamp of narrative put on this. And that has profound implications in the way that individuals in the end interpret their own role in that. Sorry, I'll stop.
Rory, can I just say one thing really fast? No, because this, yes, what's interesting about Gamari Tabrizi's analysis of the Iranian Revolution, he says as a historian and and as a professor in the US now, but writing about the Iranian Revolution, part of this book, Foucault in Iran, that he wrote opens with saying, I have to resist understanding the Iranian Revolution in terms of how it was ideologized straight after, so both during and after. And he says basically, and therefore the polarization of kind of the, the kind of Islamic narrative that comes, the Western narrative that comes, that, so in a way his work is trying to work against the highly ideological framing of the Iranian Revolution and trying to see it in its moment as something that was unique and exceptional and then was taken. So all this to say that, that argument comes from a person that is trying to resist the big ideologization, if you will, that came about the Iranian Revolution that you're saying, of course, in Tunisia wasn't present.
Anyone else? Can I squeeze in a question? I'm really interested in this, in what you've been talking about, this relationship with the police, because it definitely fits with the impression that I've got from work that I've done. I mean, talking to protesters who were in Tatooine, they definitely have this extraordinary kind of sense of confrontation with the police, even in the vocabulary that they use about the police. I guess the two things I would say, one is that you're right to point out the connection between the ultras and this confrontation with the police. And that's something that predates the revolution as well, right? And there's this really interesting idea that football stadiums provided this particular space where people were able to confront the police in a degree of security. But secondly, the question for me is, if we're trying to understand this in terms of its relational effects, we need to think about not just the evaporation of fear on the part of the young people that you've been talking to, but also how the role of the police has changed over the last decade too, because you would assume that if young people's fear has indeed evaporated, and that's certainly what I've heard from some people, you would expect the police to be a sort of diminished force, but instead you see kind of quite the opposite. They are much stronger, they're emboldened, and we see its effects all the time. I mean, just on January the 14th and the protests on the anniversary of the revolution, the police were pretty brutal downtown, and it looks like they feel that the Qais Said regime has allowed them to get away with this, in fact, encourages this. And we saw really strong confrontations in January 2021 between citizens and the police. So what are we looking at when we see these confrontations? Is this some kind of reenactment, some attempt to recapture that moment from the early revolutionary days? Or is this something else? Is this the enactment of a more kind of repressive authoritarian regime that we're seeing? How do I interpret it?
Okay, I don't have an answer, so you can all roll your eyes at the anthropologist, but I find really interesting, because a lot of the Tunisians I've spoken with who don't live in Italy, so that I met when I went to Tunis, are now policemen. So they were involved in the days in the revolution. They are from various working class suburbs of Tunis. And a lot of them, after the revolution, enrolled in the police, and they say, the salary is better than it used to be, and so that's something again that I want to think through much closer, because I think that's also really interesting, that the ways in which, I suppose, the labor market and the police force, I mean, I don't know the numbers and you are the experts, but my sense is that it's kind of, if anything, emboldened in many ways, and more variety. So you have also like very young kids, and maybe also kids with like an education at different levels, maybe considering it in a way that maybe it wasn't necessarily before. I mean, depends on your family trajectory and so on. So there's something going on there as an opportunity to make your life, but also in a context where a lot of your understanding of the revolutionary moment, the pre and straight after, was in this confrontation. And my understanding of this is very much from the perspective of others who were involved in the days of revolution and did not become policemen. And they're kind of cynical / understanding comments about their friends and neighbors, saying like, basically it's a decent job, and there's the corruption is still there, so you can get the good side entry in your pocket, and these kinds of comments. But yeah, I just wonder in which ways and whether and what would happen to an argument like mine when at the center, if my interlocutors were these, young men involved in the uprisings who then joined the forces. And I'm hoping to do more on that. And then there's the question of the confrontation with the police as a, yeah, and you're right, the scenes can be pretty brutal, like in contemporary, times, and I wonder in which ways they are being framed, and in which ways, because if we're sensing at some level at least, and with some specifically positioned subjects at least, that there is less fear towards the police, this often means that, if anything, the moves and the moves the police has to adopt sometimes has to be extra brutal, because fear is a very good weapon of control, and if that's left used, so I suppose following more closely the development of this evaporation of fear, at least for some, is really important, and also the ways in which, especially at least for working class urban youth, how actually the police is one of the pathways into kind of adulthood, like with a relatively decent salary and stability.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions, anyone? Or should we leave it there? Let's leave it there. Sorry, Francesco, fire ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I had to mute my mic. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I understand very little of this, so I found it fascinating. I'm kind of more of a numbers person, so I'm wondering if, in fact, the validity of your study, in some ways, is precisely in the fact that it's able to trace through personal stories the story of the revolution in many ways. The kind of enthusiasm at the beginning. So in the memory of the people you have interviewed, it becomes this incredible moment of unity and solidarity, and even across different neighborhoods, or people who support different teams or what have you, the example that you gave. And then kind of the memory of this early enthusiasm and success is emphasized over the years, because the memory kind of fades back in a way, and it's a contrast with the disenfranchisement and disillusion and in some ways disgust with the political system that is in place today, that is quite obvious in the opinion polls that you see about how Tunisians think about politics and political parties and parliament and so on. So I think if you are thinking of publishing this in a political science journal rather than an anthropology journal, I don't think the fact that you have 4 people for 10 years is a huge obstacle. Well, it depends on the journal, of course, but I don't think it'd be a huge obstacle, because you can use, if you want, the career, we call it career in brackets, I suppose, of these people as a way to tell the story of the revolution. So I do think you have something that is actually quite useful, quite interesting, particularly because a good few journals now, and I think political science is finally moving a bit away from numbers. I think this kind of ethnographic anthropological work is precisely what is missing, and what we have been missing in political science for some time, particularly when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, the ability to tell stories in a way that then connect to a larger story. So mine is not necessarily a question. It's more like I think you have something here that would be quite interesting for a lot of people reading political science journals, because your micro stories connect to a macro story in many ways. And I think that there's a way to fit the two together in an article for a political science journal, if that is what you might be interested in.
That's so kind, Francesco. I've never thought of it's a scary thought to think of a political science journal, but that's a really kind comment. And I think, this has been such a good welcoming space to think together about this material, because in a way and your comment captures this, but this is the same debates that happen also within anthropology. There's just more space for certain types of knowledge making and less space for other types of knowledge making. But the relationship between the particular and the general, if you will, and the power that I suppose stories, for example, should have, not only say to move us, but actually to move us, say, emotionally, but also to move our analysis, is not something that is accepted and everybody, say, in anthropology accepts it. It's an ongoing debate, and it's something that I mean, Rory heard one of my papers, I think, in Oxford, and like my work on migration is kind of doing the same. It's trying to, connect, like, the life of my work on migration is most in Moroccan villages where most men have left for Europe. And I'm arguing that you can learn something about migration theory by paying attention to what happens in these villages and families in the absence of migration, if you will. So all this to say that relationship between the particular and the general, the local and the global, is something that is really much harder to make an argument for than you may expect, even in anthropology. And I think thank you. And also I think I agree, like it's really important to make that connection and have those conversations. And it's not always straightforward how to make it the most effectively. If you
that is definitely the challenge, and also the extra challenge of then having to further generalize outward from Tunisia, so that Tunisia does not become, the story, that Tunisia as well is a part of a macro story about the phenomenon you're analyzing. And I think that's the most difficult part. But in a way, the challenge is in itself is intellectually interesting. And I think that there's a home in political science journals for something like that. I think we are seeing it a bit more, precisely because people like me can't really explain very much at the end of the day with our little numbers and our little tables. And so I think that there's an acceptance that there should be room for something else as well. I see Chiara here, who's on the call. She's done something similar in some ways, kind of an ethnographic studies that she was able to connect to a macro story about democracy. And I think that, I think there is space for that, not a huge space in political science, but there is space for that. I would encourage you to think about this further if you want to. If not, just leave the place to us and our numbers.
You come and talk to us for one afternoon and we turn you into a political scientist. But Francesca's right. And if you look, for example, at recent issues of comparative political studies, you'll see that there's lots of work now on comparative ethnography, which is really not far away from what you're talking about. So, I mean, the goal in inviting you to, as an anthropologist, to a political science department is because I think that these discussions between disciplines can be really productive. And I think what you've been talking about today really touches on a lot of the findings that we have picked up in our own research in Tunisia, and that's why it's so valuable for us. And you can see from the richness of the questions that people asked just how productive your insights have been. So Alice, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I really enjoyed it. I wish you lots of luck with this paper, whether it's published in an anthropology journal or indeed a political science one. And good luck with your research.